Welcome, everyone. I'm Vice President of Programming for our Ohio Valley ICF chapter, and I want to welcome you today to our part of our monthly virtual education series for the chapter, and welcome people that aren't in Ohio Valley chapter as well. We're today have Helene Seiler. Am I saying that right?
Yep.
Seiler. She is doing some work for us, a talk on executive coaching through the eyes of the executive, through the eyes of the coach and the client. Sorry about that. And so I want to just tell you a little bit about Helene. I have this fabulous biography here. I'm not going to tell you all of it. I think you all got some of it in the email. But I do want to tell you a little bit about Helene, who is a leadership coach. She has over 25 years experience in organization and leadership development and in talent management. She's been coaching and training executives since 2001. Helene is bilingual English, French, and has worked and lived in North America, Western Europe, and Southeast Asia, which we were just discussing a little bit about. Currently works in London, and it plans to move back to Connecticut in the U.S. in 2019. Since 1997, she has run a private practice as Helsei Consulting, and she is currently incorporated both in the U.S. and the U.K. As a leadership coach, Helene conducts individual and group coaching programs for senior and high middle level managers of international organizations. She has extensive experience working all over the world for C-suite leaders, women leaders, and expats in various industries, including financial services, professional services, consumer products, oil and gas, government, NGOs, United Nations, and international education. We're so glad to have you. She has the certification level of Master Certified Coach with the ICF, and so we're all, very glad to have you here. I'm always impressed when I meet a master coach because it's so many hours required to get that certification. I just think it's just amazing amount of work that goes into it. So I'm going to hand it over now to you, Helene, and thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Now comes the first challenge. I'm going to make my first attempt at sharing my desktop. So let's see if this works. And open the presentation. So just bear with me a second. All right. So Meredith, is this working for you? Can everybody?
I can see it. This is Michelle. It looks fine.
Excellent, excellent. So warm welcome to everybody. Thank you very much, Meredith, for organizing everything and supporting me with the Zoom onboarding process. And thank you, Michelle, for inviting me, first of all, and also for your very kind introduction. I have to say, it's interesting what you said about being a master certified coach. After having investigated the client perspective for 3 years as part of my thesis experience, I'm not quite sure I'm a master anymore. And I really have changed some of my views about, how I see myself. Am I really an expert? I'm not sure. I think we work together with the client to make the most effective coaching session for them. So the title of the webinar is called Executive Coaching Through the Eyes and Ears of the Client. And the reason I put eyes and ears, it echoes the topic of feedback, which is going to be really what I'm going to talk about today. It's about client feedback. And I will focus on executive coaching because it is what I know. However, I'm sure some of you are also life coaches. Some of my findings may apply to life coaching as well. And the subtitle of the presentation is we are the masters of feedback. Why not let our clients reciprocate? And the reason for that subtitle is that I have, and I'm sure most of you have been trained into very fancy feedback techniques as a support to our coaching process. And what's really surprising, at least for me, which I will share in a little bit, we don't really equip our clients to do the same to us. And this is what my doctoral thesis is about. So I'm going to move on, and we are, I think, for the second time going to practice a little technical marvel with Meredith at the helm of this. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and bear with me, because this question is not about client feedback, it's about coach feedback to client. I want to start there, and I just want to take a little poll, very simple. When you do a coaching session, do you or do you not give feedback to your clients? And I will let you use any definition of feedback that you want. We will talk about definitions later, so it can be any definition of feedback. And Meredith's going to launch this first poll just to find out how many of you actually give feedback. And there's a second question, as you can see on the poll. If you give feedback, do you give it regularly throughout your session? Do you give it only at the end of a session or at the end of the coaching process? Do you do all of it or none of it? So I think, Meredith, you probably know how long it takes to get answers, and we'll just wait until these answers come in.
Okay, so I have a progress panel that I can see. So we've got half of the people on who voted, and we've got some more things coming in. So I'm just going to wait a second, maybe another 15 seconds or so. And unfortunately, the person who's calling in on the phone can't see. It can only be the people who are on the computer. So right now it looks like the answers have sort of slowed down. And on question 1, it says, do you give feedback to your clients? 11 people said yes. 1 person said no.
Yeah.
So we've got 11 or 12 folks voting. And then on the second question, the 2 top choices, same, 5 votes each, regularly throughout the session, and all of the above. And then 1 person voted none of the above.
Great.
So I'm going to end the polling now, and I'm going to share the results so you can see.
Great. Excellent.
Okay. Great.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting. It's very consistent with what I found out when I started my thesis. We always have to start with a review of the literature, the research literature. And there's been research conducted about 10 years ago about the prevalence of coach to client feedback. And about 90%, 90% of the coaches, executive coaches, said that they were giving feedback to their clients. So fairly consistent here. There was not any research about the frequency. And it's interesting that to note that the giving feedback throughout the coaching session was prevalent in this group. So I'm going to continue now with the second and final poll. So now it's the opposite that I'm asking about. I'm asking whether you ask your clients for feedback. Again, I'm not putting any limits on the definition, your definition that you have. And same thing, do you ask, what frequency do you ask? So I'm going to ask Meredith again to put up the poll. So remember, it's the opposite now. do you ask clients for feedback about yourself?
I've got some responses coming in that I can see. Once I end it, I can share the results. This is kind of exciting. This is new for us.
It works very well. It's amazing.
Yeah, I like it. I'm glad I tried it out last month and I was able to try it out again this month for you. So right now we've got 12 out of 12 saying yes to the first question. Do you ask clients for feedback? A little bit of mixed results on the second one. And I'll leave it open for another 5 or 10 seconds or so. Top choice on the second question is all of the above. Second highest rating is at the end of the session. And then the third is at the end of the coaching process. And I'm going to go ahead and close this. These are quick. Let's share the results. And there you go.
Great, fantastic. So again, and we'll go into details a little bit more later, but there were not that many investigations of client feedback. There were a few surveys conducted by the ICF. No, I'm sorry, let me take this back. It was Sherpa coaching, again for executive coaches. A lot of coaches said that they requested feedback from their client. I think we were around over 2/3 of coaches. So you guys seem to be asking for feedback more than the average, which is impressive. All right, so now I want to share my experience, my journey into client feedback. First of all, to show you how I experienced a discrepancy myself between receiving client feedback and giving feedback to clients. First of all, I want to share that when I started my coaching journey back in 2001, I did not initially request client feedback. This skill was not taught to me when I went to coaching school. We were also told that we were experts. We were told that we were trained to be experts in coaching techniques, asking great questions, facilitating. We were told some tools which we were supposed to apply, and really there was no scope for clients to really give us any feedback about what we did. However, very quickly I started to work for corporations, and my clients routinely asked to the executives, so my corporate clients, routinely asked to the executives that I coached to give me ratings. So I started to receive feedback, even though I did not ask for it. And the feedback I received was usually at the end of the coaching process. It was usually a satisfaction rating. The question that really terrified me was, would you recommend this coach, Hélène, to your colleagues on a scale from 1 to 5? And I have to say, I still have to go through these surveys, and they still make me very uncomfortable. And I want to share a story that happened to me just 2 months ago. I went through this, and I had been coaching, face-to-face during a leadership development workshop with 5 individuals, and they each gave me a rating based on that question, and I got a 3.6 out of 5, average. Nobody would tell me, which client put me a 4 or 5 or a 3 or even a 2, I don't know. And so it was useless. I didn't know who gave me what, and more importantly, I didn't know what I did or did not do that made these executives believe that it was worthwhile or not worthwhile recommending me to someone else. So that's an example that just happened to me recently, but I just felt, over the years and until the time I chose my topic of research, that this was not feeling right. I just feel judged, as I put on my presentation. And the other thing is that I simply didn't know what to ask. Nobody taught me what to ask. Should I talk about my results, the impacts on clients, my technique, my behaviors? And if yes, which technique, which behaviors, which kind of results, when? Because it depends. If you are going to ask feedback throughout a coaching session, it's probably not the same questions that if you are going to ask feedback at the end of a process. So when I enrolled in the doctoral program at Oxford Brookes University, where I just completed my doctorate, I had all these questions with me. On the other side, my experience giving feedback to clients was great. I started giving feedback to my clients on day one. Why? Because I got certified in psychometrics, in 360 instruments that had been empirically developed and validated. I learned to use them in a developmental way and not an evaluative way. So that meant that, as you probably have experienced when you undergo a training to become accredited with one of these instruments, the way they teach it to you is that, don't tell people what they should do. Just look at the results with them and ask them to recall an event where they might have displayed this certain behavior or did that certain task and how it would have impacted the other person. So it's the way we're taught to deliver these things are not judging, it's developmental, it's non-judgmental, as I said, and it's also dialogic. So we go back and forth, nobody's right or wrong. We're not here to assess people, but we're here to give them some pointers. Hey, this is how you impact others, or this is how others sees you, or this is how you compare to others if it's a psychometrics, for example. So I thought like there was a big gap between what I was experiencing in the receiving seat and what I was experiencing in the giving seat. So that's sort of what led me to choose my topic of research. So now I'm going to bring you online, if you'd like, because it's time that we talk about what feedback means. There are many, many definitions of feedback. In fact, it has been characterized in research as what we call an immature concept. So there are many definitions out there. And what I'd like to, if you're interested, is to hear from three people, up to three people in the audience. The reason I'm only asking for three is just in the interest of time. I want to make sure we cover all the presentation, and you also have a chance to ask questions later on as well. So what I would ask, if you are interested to share your definition, is that you keep it short, about 1 minute per person, so that, again, in the interest of time. So I'll leave this in your capable hands, Meredith.
Sure. So we can, I think Helene would love to hear you talk and explain. So if you want to raise your hand or indicate via the chat function if you're willing to talk to the group, I can promote you so that you can be seen and heard. Or I think there's a way for you to raise your hand. I can't actually see that because I'm the admin of the group, but I think there's a way to raise your hand too to indicate that you would like to give us the definition. So I'll just wait a second. Let's be a shy group today.
Okay. Well, again,
Okay.
me for sure, but it's your definition, huh?
Yeah, it's Michelle.
Thank you,
I'm not
Michelle.
I'm going to prime the pump here. I hope other participants will weigh in. My definition of feedback is feedback. It's a process by which we share information with another person about how they're doing, how they're being perceived, what I'm or they are hearing, depending on who's doing the feedback. And I think it's a process in that you want to make sure the other person is hearing what you're saying. So you are checking back in on how the feedback landed. And also a piece that it's not probably maybe part of a definition, but part of the process, I like to hear from the person that's being provided the feedback, how they feel about how they did. Get their kind of perspective on how they think it's going, whatever they're being given feedback about. That was like really a terrible definition, but that's all I have to say on it.
Thank you, Michelle.
All right, Helene, we've got one who typed into the chat, and I've got another who's gonna want to talk. But John says, being given the opportunity to see a potential blind spot.
Oh, great.
And then Brian, thank you for raising your hand. I'm going to allow you to talk, so there'll just be a few second delay here. Okay. Brian, go ahead.
I think Brian is muted.
No, I'm unmuted. Let's see. Brian, hear
There
us?
it goes. There it is. He's unmuted.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Brian, can you hear us? Oh, he's just going to type instead. Something,
okay.
maybe a technical difficulty here. But in the meantime, I've got Bonnie is willing to talk, and then we can wait on Brian's. Let's see. So, Bonnie, I'm going to turn your video on and unmute you. Well, I tried. There you go, Bonnie. Go ahead.
Okay, I think you can hear me now.
We can.
For me, feedback is providing information that allows them to take something away that they can work on or not work on. It's up to them. So typically when I started feedback sessions as a manager, I would lay out the facts of what I had received, and I would ask them to look at it and tell me what they wanted to do with the information. And if they didn't want to do anything, that was valid as well. So, so for me, feedback is kind of a neutral. It's really their information to decide what they want to do with, and then I step back and allow them to make that decision. I'm not sure that resonates as much, but that's kind of the way I handle it. It's not a good or a bad. It's just a fact of what it is.
All right. Okay, and Brian says, providing the opportunity to pause, reflect, and communicate their thoughts on what they are or have experienced.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I think you pretty much captured it, and I want to show you two things. To show you how the process is unbalanced. So what you can see on the screen now, it's a sample, it's a fake 360 degree review. Meredith, I've got a message that my connection is unstable, so if you suspect that I need to speak louder or anything, just let me know. But
Helene, I'm getting the same thing. So I wouldn't worry about it right now. I don't know what it is, but mine said the same thing. I thought it was my home.
Okay.
We can hear you just fine.
But if there's a problem, you just let me know. So this is just a random page for a 360. And again, this is the example where the coach gives feedback to the client, and you can see how plentiful this is. I mean, we're talking about a competency called strategic perspective. You can see all the behaviors. You can see all the raters groups, the rater groups. They have given ratings from 1 to 5. There's even up there a comparison. So, for example, we can see that the peers were the little purple inverted triangle on the upper part, on the upper table. They rate this person very high compared to other peers. So full of information, empirically validated, extremely comprehensive, and one can only imagine the richness of the discussion that could take place for a client if they were to, have a developmental conversation with their coach about that. So that's one side of the mirror. Now, let's look at the other side. This is an example, a typical example of a coachee evaluation form. So that's for me. So I'd say this is your coach, Helen Seiler. And this is an actual real rating sheet that I receive from one of my corporate clients. So there would be the name of the executive on this one. At least I would know who rated me. And so the question is, please give us feedback about how beneficial you found the coaching provided by Mrs. Helen Seiler by reading the effectiveness and circling the appropriate number. Okay. And so if I look at this, I can guarantee that I'm not going to make any progress next time because I don't know what I did to deserve a 1, 2, 3, 4, or a 5. So of course there are questions there. What did you appreciate? But I will talk about this more. Appreciation and satisfactions are not the best way to judge a coaching session. Coaching can be sometimes a little bit difficult for clients. It's not necessarily good news if they say they appreciated everything you did. So just to show you how different it is. On the one hand, you've got tools, you've got things that have been developed for years and years. And on the other end, you've got basic things. Nothing's been researched, nothing's been validated. Everybody has a different thing. And that is, again, goes at the core of why I did this research. So I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of the two types of feedback. And I introduce a distinction here between what I call formative feedback and summative feedback. I'm going to explain a little bit more what it is. I'm sure most of you know, especially if you do facilitation or if you are educators, formative is about the process, the tools, the means that lead to the result, right? And summative is about the result. And I think at the core of this, it's important to distinguish the two and to reflect about what are the pros and cons of each type of feedback. What's good about receiving evaluative feedback, in other words, feedback about your result, and what's bad about that. And on the other side, what's good about receiving formative or developmental feedback and what's not so good about it. So I would like to open it up again. You don't need to comment on everything, but I'd be interested if you have some thoughts. Maybe you've already thought about this yourself. Some pros and cons of developmental feedback on the one hand and evaluative feedback on the other hand. So if anybody would like to come on the on the mic and talk about this, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
And you can also, type your comments into the chat if you'd like. I can read those out. Okay, Bonnie has raised her hand. So Bonnie, I'm going to allow you to talk in just a second. Okay.
There's pros and cons to both of them in my mind, Helene.
Yeah.
On the, what you call developmental feedback, I think it gives the recipient, certainly it can have a rich conversation if the feedback is rich. But if you wind up with something that just says take more training, it's kind of a dead issue. Whereas the other feedback can also fall flat because the conversation around what needs to be done is really where the work gets done. It's not in the numbers. And so if you're having a conversation with somebody who's very focused on numbers, it's hard to get them to focus on the other piece of it. So I think both of them have pros and cons. It just depends on how good they're done. And as you say, it's hard to say, they gave me a number, or what does that mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that's great.
Okay. There we go. Anyone else? All right, quiet group today.
All right, so that's fine. We'll probably have more questions as we move along. Now, I want to talk a little bit now about what we know. There is a lot of research, a lot of information available about client summative feedback. So it's interesting what Bonnie said, because it's not in the numbers, as she said. It can be useful. And it's interesting that most of the research today has developed tools to give evaluative or summative feedback for the executive coach. And I don't know if some of you went to ICF Converge in Washington, D.C. Last summer. I was there, and there was a presenter who presented about an extraordinary way to measure the return on investment of a coaching intervention in large organizations. And he was using a model which is very well known in training, which is called the Kirkpatrick model, with 4 levels. And this model has been adapted to coaching. And this is the model I actually used to reflect about evaluative feedback from the client. So how can the client give us some evaluative feedback? I want to start from the bottom of the screen. You can see 1, it's level 1. It's when you just measure the reaction, the satisfaction of the client. I gave you an example earlier. As I said, there are problems with satisfaction surveys because research has shown that coaching is not always a comfortable process. However, there's a measure that has been adapted from psychotherapy, which is called the Working Alliance, and it measures the bonding and the agreement between the coach and the client. This is a very good level 1 measure, which has been linked to goal attainment. It's been linked to the success of coaching. At the second level, we can see another aspect of result, which is our client getting new ideas? Are they getting learnings and insights about themselves? We call it cognitive change. There are a lot of measures that have been developed empirically, such as the self-insight scale, the self-compassion, the self-reflection scales, They are very prevalent in research, not that much developed in practice. I don't think that many corporations use them. It's just a reflection of there is still in the coaching industry a divide between researchers and practitioners. And this is a place where, probably it would be good if researchers' voices could be heard more, because there are really good instruments there. There is then the third level, which is one you're probably very familiar with, behavioral change. As a result of the coaching, does your client behavior evolve? And so one of the things that some corporations do is that they do 360s pre-post coaching to see if there are differences. That's best practice, very difficult to implement. But they also, sometimes they will ask clients to rate the level of attainment of their goals at the end of the coaching process, which is called retrospective degree of change. Finally, at the fourth level, there are the very complex studies that I referenced earlier, calculating the financial ROI or measuring the impact on the well-being of the workplace or the work engagement. So lots of studies have been made. Conclusion generally is that coaching is effective. It is effective. It does strengthen the working alliance. It does strengthen the cognitive change, does produce some behavioral change. The jury is still out in terms of the impact on the organization, just because there hasn't been as many studies. It's very expensive to conduct such things. So my key point here, key message on this slide is there is lots of information, lots of tools and findings about evaluation of what the coach does of the coaching process. Now, I want to talk about developmental feedback for the executive coach. And I'm going to start with the experts models, then moving on to the sponsors, which are the corporations that hire executive coaches. Then I will talk about supervisors, and then I will talk about the clients. So when I started my doctoral research, I became very interested in coaching behaviors. And the first place I went to was obviously the ICF competency model. The ICF competency model was built incrementally. I don't know, some of you may have received a survey. I just completed it last week. And so they use a task analysis approach, and they ask experts, which are us, the coaches, and coaching school trainers as well, and they ask them, what they believe are the most important coaching competencies for success. But the ICF model has never ever asked any clients. They've never included clients. They are not alone. There are 15 professional coaching associations who have a worldwide scope, and they also use the same method to collect information about effective behaviors and competencies. They use a task analysis approach with experts. None of them are the same. I attempted to compile them for my research. I couldn't. And on top of it, there are researchers who have engaged in their own investigation using different methodologies. Not many people have used clients. Actually, I could only identify one survey conducted over 10 years ago, asking clients what they thought. So it's very, very difficult to put them together. One of their major drawbacks is that they are not linked to coaching outcomes. In other words, if you look at the list of coaching competencies of ICF, nobody has ever attempted to measure whether they actually lead to coaching success. There has not been any researcher yet who has attempted that. So they're there. We more or less trust the experts, but it would be good to have another validation. So when we go through our accreditation process with ICF and we receive feedback, we're not completely sure if we are receiving feedback on what we should be. The clients are not involved. There are many organizations, researchers out there who have done their own investigation, and then these competencies are not linked to the outcome. So it was a huge discovery for me. I had no idea this was the case. Now moving on to the sponsors, the corporations, they don't want to spend money on that, and they tend to outsource the process back to the experts. So then we have the supervisors. I hope all of you are under supervision. If you're not, go on the ICF and find yourself a supervisor. I have one. I've had one since I discovered what supervision was about 7 years ago. Supervisors are very good to support internal feedback, feed-forward feedback. There is such thing as internal feedback. We sometimes receive feedback from ourselves, just reflecting on what we did. The technique feed-forward, I'm sure you're familiar with it, is when you imagine an ideal situation and what you could have done to reach this ideal situation. Supervisors are excellent to support internal feedback, but they cannot concern themselves with external feedback, or they become experts themselves, which, at least we would be better off to use the ICF model, which has been developed through a task analysis process. And then there are the clients. The clients are the forgotten one. Nobody has ever researched anything about what they think about what are important coaching competencies or behaviors. But they have been researched in situ. So when they are being coached, I want to give you one example. One of my two supervisors for this thesis is called Adrian Myers. He works at Oxford Brookes University. And he, for his PhD research, he observed coaching pairs during a coaching sessions and asked an observer, an external observer who was an expert in coaching, to watch the coaching session with him. After each coaching session, he asked the client, the coach, and the expert to share how they think the coaching session went. Not only he found that they had different evaluative perspectives, so they evaluated the coaching session differently, but they also found did not see, did not experience, did not hear the same things. So not only the evaluative part was discrepant, but also the summative part. The experts were the farther remote from the client. The coaches were closer, especially when it came to all the empathetic behaviors. Usually coaches and clients agreed. But in terms of the process itself, there were huge disagreements. And this was later confirmed by another researcher whom you may know, who is called Eric De Haan. He works at Astridge School of Business in the UK, and he did the same sort of study. They both, Adrian and Eric, found out that the coaches overestimate their ability to be facilitative and non-directive. So they would say, oh, I was very much in a facilitative position, I was non-directive, whereas the client would say, no, that's not how I experienced it. My coach was directive. So there are discrepancies. So that's why it is so important to get the client perspective, because they bring an additional layer of information. The problem is that in all of these investigations, the clients were very reluctant to share their perspective. They were happy to share the results. They were happy to share the impact, but they were very shy about sharing what behaviors they had observed, what processes they had observed. One of the reasons could be that there is a what has been identified as a dominant discourse in coaching, which I alluded to at the very beginning of my presentation. When you're trained in coaching, you are told you need to learn a craft. You are told you need to become an expert very quickly to provide value to your clients. And maybe that's the message that we convey to our clients. They see us as experts and they don't think that they have these skills. I have to adopt this very, very much because when, especially in executive coaching, we are dealing with people who usually have teams, they have direct reports, even though they may not exactly be able to formalize what they're doing, a lot of them are actually using managerial coaching skills. They are giving feedback to their teams. So it's a very strange situation that has probably prevented the client to be involved more into giving feedback to the coach. I'm going to show you a method that I think was pretty similar to what Bonnie shared with us earlier. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's this feedback where you start with a situation, you describe a behavior that happened during that situation, and you share the impact that it has on you. Coaches are very good at doing this with their clients, and clients, for some reason, in all these research, were very reluctant. They were happy to talk about the situation. They were happy to talk about the impact, very shy about talking about the behavior. But this is where the gift is for us coaches. If we manage to get our clients to tell us what sort of behaviors led to what sort of impact, then we will be much better off, and we will be able to reflect and add with all the other feedback we have received and be more effective with our client next time. So I want to pause here for a second before I go into my research results, and wanted to know if at this stage there were any questions, comments, reactions. Do you agree? Does it make sense? Is it a complete surprise? Please feel free to share anything that comes up at this stage.
You can put your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box. And Michelle says it all makes total sense.
Thank you, Michelle.
Might take a second for folks to type.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Jay says, I like the coaching impact levels. Mike was wondering if you could, and then I just lost that, back up to the previous slide.
Yes.
Just to take a look for just a second. Brian says, makes sense to me. Looking forward to hearing what's next. Adam says, agreed, makes sense. And I think that's it for right now.
All right.
All right, thanks.
Okay. So, what did I do? So my doctoral research journey was, okay, I want to figure out how I could build a feedback instrument for the client. Not that I was hoping to get something as developed as the 360 instrument that I showed you before. I think that's going to take a little bit longer. But at least could I offer a list of behaviors that the client could use to start a conversation with the coach so that they know, the coach knows, the client knows what to give feedback on. So the journey started in September 2015, and for most of 2016, I compiled the literature. I read everything I could about coaching competencies, executive coaching competencies, feedback, client feedback. I quickly found out that there wasn't much in coaching research, so I branched out. I looked into psychotherapy, education, nursing, sports, medicine, and I found more information there. And I ended up with a compilation of 88 behaviors. Then, from March to May 2017, I ran the list through 5 focus groups. So what you see on the picture, you see the cards that we were manipulating. So I had my 88 behaviors on cards, and I told to my first focus group, okay, look at this, pull this apart, change anything that you think doesn't work, if it's jargon, if you can't understand it, and sort it out. Tell me which ones, from your perspective, are the most effective. So to do that, I went back to the 4 levels and I showed them the 4 levels. And then I said, also, I want you to sort out the ones that are the most difficult. That means things that are difficult to do if you haven't been trained as a coach. I was really trying to sort them out. I knew I was never going to have enough participants with 88 behaviors. I really needed to sort this through the focus groups. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. The knowledge that existed in this group. So we had 5 focus groups. Initially, I thought I needed only 1 or 2, but there was so much discussion. People were bringing stories from their own coaching experience. I have to say that a prerequisite for these focus group participants that they had been coached at least once. So these were experienced clients, if I may say so, but they were also leaders. They also had teams, and they started to think about how they were coaching their team members. And so they reviewed, they shuffled, they sorted. It was an unbelievable experience for me. I had webinars which took place with thanks in part to the ICF. Something that you may want to know if you're interested in doing research. We have a fantastic director of research called Joël Didier-Rolamo, and if you submit a serious research proposal, he can help you disseminate the research information to potential participants. So he did this for me. So I got participants from that were referred to me by ICF coaches, and then using my own networks. We had 25 participants, and I had a waiting list, which I didn't use because at some point I had reached saturation. Then the next phase was to actually bring this list. So we cut it down from 88 behaviors to 35 behaviors. And we brought this list to people who are actually experiencing coaching. So for that, I had to find if some corporations were willing to let me interview participants of a coaching program. And it was very, very difficult, but I managed to find 100 participants. And for these participants, they received 2 surveys. One survey took place at the beginning of the coaching to get some qualifying information and a measure of the self-awareness of the client, which at the time I thought may have an influence on the coaching process. And at the end of the coaching process, I asked them to look at the 35 behaviors, tell me which one they had experienced to what extent, and then I asked them to tell me about the working alliance and the generation of new insight and goal attainment. Initially, I also wanted to ask coworkers for goal attainment, because everybody in research says, if you ask people to self-rate their goal attainment, they're likely to inflate the scores. Unfortunately, it was too complicated. I couldn't get enough coworkers, so I had to stick with self goal attainment measure. So as you can imagine, my idea was then, okay, I'm going to look at all these behaviors. I'm going to look at the working alliance. I'm going to look at the generation of new insight and goal attainment and see which behaviors are most likely to generate what outcome. So these surveys were on for the remainder of 2017. And then during the first quarter of 2018, I used a software called SPSS 23 to run the analysis. And I did two types of analysis. I'm sorry, I go into a little bit of technical here, but I think it's helpful to you to understand what's behind research and the importance, you know, when you use a tool to find out what kind of research was behind it. In my case, I use factor analysis because what I wanted to do, I wanted to make sure that my behaviors hung well together. I also wanted to reduce the number of behaviors because if some behaviors were very correlated to others, that probably meant that I could have some representative behaviors, which actually happened. My instrument went from 35 to 21 behaviors, and I was also able to identify two clusters or components, as we call them. The first component that I was able to identify, which will not surprise you, are the empathetic behaviors. And the second component was the process behaviors. That's the behaviors that where the coach goes through assessment of the client situation, challenge of the client. So when the coach actively discusses the client assumption and challenges the assumptions, and the phase where the coach discusses possible changes that the client might want to make. So my two components, I call them empathy and process. Very simple. It seems like, okay, no rocket science there. We knew this, but at least I felt I was able to prove this empirically. Now, this was, remember, this was measured against a number of outcomes. So here's what I found. I found that my instrument was related to the working alliance. So these behaviors that came out of the focus groups had been shrunk to 21 behaviors, were in a strong relationship with working alliance. In other words, if the coach deploys these empathetic behaviors and if the coach is able to go through a assessment, challenge, and goal exploration process, then there will be bonding and there will be agreement between the client and the coach. So the relationship will be secured. The second thing that I found was that if the coaches apply these behaviors, then the client will experience new insights, will have new ideas. What I did not find, which was very surprising to me, was that if the coach deploys these behaviors, it will have no influence on whether or not the client will achieve their goals. So I'll talk about this more later because I asked myself, okay, why is that? Why did I find that? So I'll share my conclusion with you and we'll have a chance to discuss. So this instrument was related to the working alliance or the coach, the strengthening of the coach-client relationship on the one hand, and the generation of new insights for the client on the other hand. Now, remember I told you there were two components, empathy and process. Empathy was related to the coach-client relationship, but it was not related to the generation of new insight. However, process was related to both the working alliance, the strengthening of the relationship, and the generation of new insight. This is what I found. So now I want to share with you, and we'll come to the question and reaction later. Because first of all, I want to share with you what my conclusions were, and I would love to hear your thoughts. So in my conclusion, here's what I said about what the client, what was my understanding about what the client said about effective coaching behaviors. Empathic behaviors are necessary, but they're not sufficient. They build the coach-client relationship, but they do not contribute to the generation of new insights. I don't know if some of you were aware of this debate. There was a long debate at some point in coaching that, you know, what is coaching exactly? Can't a well-trained psychotherapist do the trick? This was, I mean, there were many studies done, and the jury was still out, may still be out, but I think in my study, I showed that probably there's more than empathetic behaviors, and the executive coach must provide the process, must provide knowledge about how to assess a client situation, an executive situation, how to powerfully challenge client's assumption about their situation, and how to inspire them to have new ideas about what they could do differently. So that's my first conclusion. My second conclusion is that informing, not advising behaviors, but informing behaviors strengthen both the working alliance and the generation of new insight. When you are in an executive coaching process and you assess a client, so you help them interpret their feedback. When you actively challenge them and you say, and they tell you, I really don't think I can manage poor performance on my team. And so if they're giving me the feedback that I'm a poor, I do not know how to manage performance, I don't accept that feedback. You as a coach have a duty to intervene and inform and say, hey, there are ways you can experiment with performance improvement. It's not advising. It's not you should do this or you should do that, but it's informing. And these behaviors require substantive knowledge. So one of my conclusions was, if you want to be a successful executive coach, and I suspect that it also applies if you are a wellness coach, for example, although I know nothing about wellness coaching, but I would assume it applies. You have got to have substantive knowledge about working in organizations. You have got to be able to powerfully challenge your client and inform him or her, but without advising him or her. Another thing that I found, and I'm sorry I cannot show you the list of behaviors right now, and I'll tell you in a minute why, but what appeared, the way the behaviors were expressed by the focus group was always in non-directive terms. So it was, for example, invited me to reflect on my strengths. I'm just making things up. Invited me to do this. Asked me if this or that. It was never evaluated my strengths or summarized this or that. It was always inviting behaviors. In other words, when I ran the focus groups always changed the wording of the behaviors when they were directed. They always shifted them to inquired about, invited me to, asked if, rather than did this or that. So something to think about. Behaviors that invite a co-design of the process will build the working alliance and generate new insight. And finally, my fourth conclusion was goal setting and monitoring behaviors may not be needed. Because first of all, the focus groups eliminated a lot of them. And then during my analysis, a lot of these behaviors went out of the feedback tool, and the feedback tool was not related to goal setting. That means other things. You know, when the client, because the interesting thing in my research was that clients actually achieve goals. They achieve goals, and so something else made them achieve the goals. Of course, I do not know what it was. When I ran analysis, I found out that the more they had insights, the more they would achieve their goals. And also that the more the working alliance was strong, the more they would achieve their goals. So there was probably something there that came from the strengthening of the working alliance and from the strengthening of the development of new insight that helped clients reach their goal, but it was not directly the coach behavior. And when I thought of this more, I was reminded of some research that I read at the beginning of my literature research. In psychotherapy, they have decades of research, and they were able to actually measure the contribution of different factors to the success of therapy. What they found is that the coach technique was only explaining 15% of the variance of the outcome. The relationship between the coach and the client contributed to 30%. And 40% was the client's own personality and circumstance. You remember that at the very beginning of my survey, I had measured the self-awareness of client because I was trying to capture these 40%. I was not successful. So self-awareness was not the right measure. There's probably another measure out there, but the client is responsible for 40%. And then there is the rest in psychotherapy was characterized as the placebo effect. It's just a hope, you know, that when you enter a therapeutic relationship, things are going to turn out for the best. So if you do a very bad math, and I'm sorry about that, you just add the coach technique and half of the relationship you attribute to the coach. Less than a third of coaching success is due to the coach. So maybe that's one of the reasons why my instrument was not related to goal setting and attainment. One of the things that came to my mind is that managers are very good at giving themselves goal and keeping themselves accountable. Probably they don't need the coach for that. And maybe we should think about how much time we spend babysitting our clients. Maybe we should not. So just my thought. I just want, before I bring questions, I'm sorry I cannot show you the list of behaviors today. It's a technical reason. I still have to defend my thesis, and I will receive some comments from examiners which may impact the final selection of behaviors. So these behaviors will be available at the beginning of 2019, and I will make sure that if you're interested, I will communicate them to you if you're interested. So now, I just want to get, before I conclude with my last slide, question reactions about my research process and my findings.
So we've got some comments of thank you for sharing. Mike says fascinating research. And you can put your comments in the chat or the Q&A, whichever works for you. John asked, do you have any suggestions on how to encourage ICF to continue this research and development?
It's a great question. Shall I answer it now, or do you want me to wait until we have more questions?
We've got one more in the queue, so you can answer it now if you want, and then we can move on to the next one.
Okay. So it's a great question, and it's also a preoccupying question. There is a divide between practitioners and researchers. There's been an attempt in the past to bridge the divide, and I have to say, right now, there are parts of me who are very optimistic and part of me who are not optimistic. The part of me that's very optimistic is the existence of Joel Di Girolamo. This man is a gift. He's really promoting research. If you are not yet a member, there is a coaching research center of excellence. I'm giving the wrong name, but if you type coaching research, it's open to anyone who is a member of the ICF. They have fabulous webinars, just like the Ohio Valley. And I encourage you to attend these webinars, because during these webinars, you have researchers presenting their findings. So that's the good part where I'm optimistic about. Where I'm not optimistic about is that, and this is very personal what I'm going to share, ICF should stop accrediting coaching schools. They should only take care of the coaches, and they should let academia take care of the accreditation of coaching schools. This is a big mistake, because these two things should be separated. You cannot be the judge and party. And so for me, it would be great if, and there's been an attempt before, there is a graduate school alliance of coaching, which has been launched by Columbia Business School and other business schools. I'm a member, you can become a member. I think it should fall to them to accredit coaching schools and not to the ICF, because these coaching schools, if they're monitored by academia, are more likely to teach skills that are backed up by research. So again, this is very personal thought. I'm not speaking for anybody here, but this is my opinion, just my opinion.
Okay, we've got some other comments, so we'll just take them one by one. Mike says, what practical tool suggestion do you have for asking for client feedback in one-to-one coaching in general?
So I think that what I would do is, at least until I'm able to share this feedback instrument, which again will not be the truth. There are many instruments out there that can be and will be developed. But in the meantime, what you could simply do is pick the behaviors. So I really insist on behaviors. When you go on the ICF competency, sort out the behaviors and the aggregates, right? So for example, under listening, there's a number of behaviors. Look at the behaviors, and I would say pick 10 or 12 behaviors that really resonate for you. Because maybe when you went to coaching school, you were inspired by your trainer, and you've also have a sense that these behaviors are important. And just ask your clients about them. And the way I would envision it is, for example, you can do this to start with at the end of a coaching session and say, contract with your client at the beginning. Is that okay if at the end of the session, I ask you a few questions about my coaching behaviors? So start by asking them questions about what they observed, and then ask them, how do you think this impacted you? Just let them speak. You will be amazed. Just that, even if it's not, a properly researched process. I went through this when I did my focus groups. I asked them, look at these behaviors. Tell me which one were the most effective. The response was amazing. So just do it from time to time. I think it will be more interesting for you than just to ask them, to ask your client just about impact. You will make more progress, especially if you work with executives who are used to receiving and giving feedback. But it might be true of other profession as well. I mean, if you are into wellness coaches or sport coaching, it might also work. So, you know your industries.
Hey, Michelle commented there was something encouraging about what we as coaches bring and how important the working alliance is.
Absolutely. It's really fundamental. Yeah.
Cindy comments, the fact that the coach is such a small portion of the coachee's success makes sense. We are simply providing a vessel to help them get there faster. The coachee is doing all the heavy lifting.
Yes. And also what it makes me think about this comment is that sometimes we as coaches can bear more responsibility than we should. And corporations tend to also, because they're not informed, they tend to, blame a coach, fire a coach just because the client is unhappy. That's not the way it should be. Corporations should think and should know that it is also the client's responsibility. So sometimes it's good to know that, there's only so much that we can control, and that we do our best work when we try to control ourselves and when we try to influence the client and let go of the things that we cannot control.
We've got two other questions, but I know that you've got one more slide, and I want to make sure we allow for that. So I might hold those questions from Jay and Brian till the very end. And then Michelle just says, I agree with you on the value of supervision. So
Great.
I'll let you do the slide, and then we'll come back to the other questions. If you have any other comments, feel free to put it in the chat.
So my final slide is my own reflection, which again I put in the conclusion of my thesis about implication for us. So building a little bit on what I said, my advice would be to treat your client as a key provider of developmental feedback for yourself. Treat them, remember that slide where I put up the 4 constituencies: the expert, the corporate, the supervisor, and the client. Give your client 25% of the lot. And if you're not in executive coaching, if there's no sponsor involvement, then they should get 1/3 of your attention. Really rely on your client for feedback. Keep developing your empathic skills, but know this won't be enough. So one of the things that I would advocate, if I could, that, when I was trained in executive coaching, there was no difference between people who come with a background in psychology and people who come with a background in business like me. And so we were all told the same thing. I think it's a mistake. I think psychotherapists or psychologists who come into coaching need training, if they are going to be in executive coaching, need to be trained in business, organizational development, leadership. Reciprocally, people who come to coaching from me, from a consulting background, need to be developed themselves. So they need to build their capabilities. It took me many, many years to understand this. And first of all, we need to take care of ourselves, build our own emotional intelligence, and then we can start being trained as an empathic coach, but not before. And I think that's an important message. They are 2 different sets of skills. So the other thing that I wanted to reinforce is that do not shy away from contributing to the coaching conversation in a substantive way if you are knowledgeable and credible, of course. But do it. If your career was in organizational development or in marketing, don't say, oh, I'm not allowed to give advice. Yes, you're not allowed to give advice, but you are allowed to share your expertise. Inform your client if you know something. It will actually help their creativity. there has been studies about creativity. How does creativity happen? How do people get new ideas? They get new ideas when they're putting in a food processor, right, with other people's ideas. If you keep pushing your client and say, oh, you know the answers in yourself, what have you done? What have you tried? You're just letting them run their own food. Add your own food, make a menu. So I think this is an important message. The fourth learning that is trust the wisdom and experience of your client when it comes to the coaching process. Do not force feed models. Ask before. Ask for permission. I am tempted to use this. Would you like to try this? Do not apply models. Use an inquiry base. Remember, your clients, especially in executive coaching, are managers. They know plenty of tools. So wait until you have come to an agreement with your client. Be non-directive in terms of the process and be more directive in terms of the content. Yeah, so it's completely flipped versus when some of the coaching schools teach. And so that was my learning. And as I said before, ask yourself whether you really need to babysit your client when it comes to goal setting and accountability. It may not be where your value added is. It may or it may not. So these were my thoughts. And yes, I think we have a few more minutes. So yeah, I'd love to answer more questions. What I wanted to show is show my LinkedIn address. If you want to start a conversation with me, this is the best way. I'll be happy to be connected with you. And oops. And then if you want to share takeaways or anything you would like to do differently as well, please feel free to comment.
Okay. So Jay asked, what one thing motivated you to invest the time and energy to deep dive into executive coaching client feedback? He was just curious.
You know, I hate to say that, but I think at the bottom of it, it was my frustration. I felt, you know, I'm giving this gift of feedback to my clients, and I'm not receiving anything in return. And then there were other things, but I just said, okay, I wanted to get a different experience. It was a good time for me, and that's just how it all started.
Okay, and Brian asked this question. So based on your findings, do you have any general or basic recommendations for what to do and or not to do when seeking regular feedback from our clients?
You know, I think give your client permission to give you feedback. They may come from a place where they've told that they have no business giving feedback to you. They don't know anything about coaching. So give them permission, encourage them, celebrate their knowledge and their wisdom about coaching. I know it sounds bizarre because you think, well, I'm being paid to do this. Why should I invite my client to be an expert? But actually, you'll be surprised if you take this counterintuitive approach.
Okay. Cindy has this takeaway. We'll look at when it is valuable to, quote, inform. Also, we'll look at, quote, how I'm asking for feedback and consider different methods for requesting feedback compared to what I currently do.
Great.
And I know there was one person who would love the results of your research. So, Helene, you are welcome to email me that, and when it's complete, and I can send it out to those who attended today.
Yeah, I would love to do that. What's going to happen is that there's going to be an article that's going to be published by the Journal of the University. I think that's going to happen during the first quarter of 2019. And so I'll make sure to obtain the copyright for that. They usually give it very easily. And I will share that article with you.
Helene, it's Michelle. Thank you so much for being with us today. I really I really consider it an honor to have you here. And
Thank you.
somebody in our chapters did see you at the what was it, Converge late last summer in DC, and recommended you. And I'm so glad that we had you here this year. And also, just one word that I feel like that describes for me what you're leaving with me is this empowerment. It was like a very empowering discussion today. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, and I was really impressed by the logistic of this. I think it's one of the best webinar I've ever been invited to. Thank you, Meredith and Michelle, and all the planning, and also very impressed with the audience, the fact that client feedback is practiced, all the comments. It was really a treat for me. Thank you so much.
Well, good. And I have to put in a plug for Meredith, who I have come to start thinking of as our producer. She's the producer, and she's not behind. She used to try to stay more behind the scenes. She's not really behind the scenes anymore. And we could not do these programs without her. So thank you, Meredith.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I like the word producer. I like that title.
I do too. Yeah. So, Helene, until next time,
Thank
thanks
you.
again. Take care,
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.